There is one verse in the Bible that we all, brethren, probably know. It's in Romans chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, where the Apostle Paul describes his kinsmen that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. He was describing, of course, the Jewish people. Now, the same could be said about Simeon. And also Levi. Levi had it sometimes. In Genesis chapter 29 and verse 33, the mother of Simeon, she says, "Because the Eternal has heard that I was hated, he has therefore given me this son also." And she called his name Simeon, which means hearing. Hearing. Now also then in Genesis chapter 49, the prophecy of their father Jacob, verse 5 to 7, they lumped, in this prophecy they lumped together. Simeon and Levi are brethren. Now this is very interesting, brethren, because since all 12 brothers were brethren, this term must mean more than biological. So that means that they were brethren in the same outlook and interests, they were partners. And then Jacob continues, he says, "Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly mine honor be not found united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I'll divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." And that's exactly what happened to both tribes, to Simeon and to the tribe of Levi. Interestingly enough, you will find the traces of the tribe of Simeon. Many of Simeonites moved to Scotland, that's what we know. But the traces of Simeon you can find throughout other parts of the world. For example, brethren, there was a town of Lycia near Chimeria. Pliny writes about that. It was called Simena, Simeon Simena. Also, there was people of Italy on the borders of Umbria, which is the borders of Germany, on the Elba and Oder rivers, and those people are called Seminones. Also, there were people of Gaul. According to Lempriere's classical dictionary, they were called Samnitae. Lempriere also tells us the Samnites, or Samnites, a people of Italy who inhabited the country situated between Picenum, Campania, Apulia, and ancient Latium. They distinguished themselves by their implacable hatred against the Romans in the first ages of that empire, till they were at last totally extirpated in 272 before Christ, after a war of 71 years. The source of this information is Strabon, or Strabo, the famous historian, and he's quoted also in the Lempriere's classical dictionary. Now, as far as Moses' prophecies about Simeon, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 7, it says, "Hear, Eternal, the voice of Judah." Simeon is not even mentioned in the prophecies of Moses, you see. Well, "Hear, Eternal, the voice of Judah," this refers obviously to Simeon, because here, it is here within the Judah. So those who are within the Judah to be here, because the territory of the tribe of Simeon in the promised land was totally surrounded by the tribe of Judah. And again, the name Simeon means hearing. So "Hear, Eternal, the voice of Judah" refers to Simeon. Here within Judah. What was their crime? What was the crime that was described in Jacob's prophecy? Well, I won't go into details again for the sake of saving the time. In Genesis chapter 34, the crime is described. Instead of slaying Shechem, they killed a whole city of Canaanites because they disgraced their sister. Somebody disgraced in that town, somebody disgraced their sister, and therefore they killed a whole city of Canaanites instead of killing one person. Now, also during the reign of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, many Simeonites migrated south to Edom. Edom was originally part of the southern part of the Holy Land, and in Edom they conquered and displaced Amalekites. You'll find the biblical record of this in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 38 through 43. So during the reign of Hezekiah, many of them migrated to Edom. Now also, there is one historical record written by Merton Smith, and that is written in his book Israel, Her Racial Divisions and Geographical Wanderings. And on page 7, this historian suggests that Simeon's quarrel with Moses may have resulted in the removal of many Simeonites from the Holy Land. So many of them obviously emigrated from the Holy Land. He calls the Holy Land, or the Promised Land, Palestine, by the way. So, again, brethren, there is no word Palestine. That was invented by a Roman emperor who was an anti-Semite. The land was always called the land of Canaan. Later it was called Judea and Samaria. It was never called Palestine. Now, what was the quarrel? The quarrel was in Numbers 24, and in verse 14, "You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and small." This is Deuteronomy, sorry, but in Numbers there was quarrel with, in chapter 25, quarrel with Moses, between Moses and Zimri, part of the tribe of Simeon. Numbers 25 verse 14. "Now the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simeonites." So there was this quarrel, brethren. And here is a quote from Merton Smith. He says, "The quarrel with Moses," Zimri, Numbers 24:14, "seems never to have been straightened out. The tribe of Simeon is not mentioned in Moses' blessing of the tribes or in Deuteronomy 33. The other 11 tribes are recorded there. Simeon's lot in Palestine was a restricted one, and although one of the Israel 10 tribe people had its territory entirely surrounded by Judah, it has practically no Bible history." Interesting enough, you see. So they obviously many of them were removed from the Promised Land. Now, Merton Smith also says, "What became of this large part of the tribe of Simeon that seems to have disappeared from the wilderness?" So many of them didn't even go into the Promised Land, brethren. They just, as they left Egypt, they just basically didn't go and didn't want to go with Moses. Well, it is perhaps the hardest trail of all to follow, says Merton Smith. It is suggested that these Simeonites formed the Celt-Iberian migration, which moved westward from the Levant about the 15th century before Christ and settled in Brittany, Belgium, Wales, Devonshire, part of Cumberland, and part of Cornwall. These peoples are sometimes called the Simoni in classical atlases, and if so, they formed the third Israel colony to find the appointed place. The appointed place, as you remember, it was the place that Israel will find appointed place, secure place that it will not where it will never be displaced. It will not be displaced again. And then the last sentence in this quote is, "Indeed, it is very probable that their advent antedates that of Zara, Judah from Troy," because you remember the Trojan War, and Zara, Judah from Troy, they migrated, into Britain. What is interesting, we see that the numbers of Simeonites drastically dropped. So obviously not all of those Simeonites who left Egypt did go into the Promised Land. For example, in Numbers chapter 1 verse 23, we read that there were 59,300 Simeonites. And nearly 40 years later, in Numbers 26 verse 14, their number is 22,200. And the second lot, in Joshua chapter 19 verse 1, when the land was divided, second lot, their inheritance was within the inheritance of the children of Judah. And in verses 2 through 8, we see that Simeonites had 17 cities, and their surrounding village were then mentioned. So that is much that we find about Simeonites in the Bible. And again, many people who are of Scottish origin today, they're obviously a mixture between the Jewish people who migrated from the northern tip of Denmark, Judean land. Many of them moved across the sea and inhabited Scotland and Northern Ireland. But it seems that many Simeonites, as they moved also in this Celto-Iberian migration, many of them reached British Isles. And then many of them from North England reached North England and then crossed the border into what is modern Scotland.